If you look at all of the economic metrics in the automotive industry, they are more similar than they are different. And that goes for dealerships, it goes for marketplaces like AutoTrader, like Standvirtual, and it even goes for some regulation. Some countries are ahead on regulation, other countries are behind. But by and large, what I've seen over the last 20 years is that it's more similar than it is different.
Ora, bom dia mais uma vez. Estamos de volta. Espero que já todos tenham ido buscar os vossos aparelhos de tradução. E o prometido é devido. Já vimos aqui algumas imagens do nosso próximo convidado, o George Mienie, e podem perceber logo pelo vídeo que é um homem de muitas valências. Eu disse-vos que este momento ia mesmo valer a pena. O George está pela segunda vez em Portugal. A primeira foi em 2020. E ainda há pouco tempo ele esteve a moderar conversas, qualquer coisa como a última COP, a Cimeira do Clima, no Dubai. É alguém que tem feito um trabalho extraordinário na promoção de uma economia mais verde e mais sustentável. É também um daqueles que usa um veículo 100% elétrico e que na África do Sul tem contribuído muito para fazer este caminho também para uma economia descarbonizada. Ora, ele é orador, e vocês vão perceber esse poder da oratória e a forma como consegue cativar-vos. É também podcaster e é o CEO da AutoTrader, George Mienie.
Bom dia. I hope I said that right, because there's only two words I know in Portuguese, and that's bom dia and ciao. So hopefully I go home with a lot more words than I came with, but thank you so much for having me. I wish I could do this in Portuguese. You have a wonderful language, and I'd like to learn more. So thank you so much for having me. Particularly thank you to Nuno and Ricardo for inviting me. This is one of your premier summits, and I feel humbled to be here. So thank you very much. This is my second visit to Portugal, and if I picked up, you already told them that. It's my second visit to Portugal. My first visit was before the aliens landed in 2020. Which was to Qashqai. So I've been to Qashqai. I've now spent some time here with you, and I absolutely love your country. I've said for a couple of years now, there are two places that I would live if not South Africa. The one is Mauritius. Don't know why I fell in love with Mauritius. And the other is Portugal. So absolutely beautiful country. I've been at AutoTrader for some 20 years. I've been with the business since it was a print business. We were a print classifieds magazine. And through those years, we were almost disrupted. Once, twice, three times, I can't tell you how many times, it was really close. And the reason was because we had a mature brand. We were a print classifieds brand. We had lots of revenue. We were the market leader, tied up in a magazine. And we were almost disrupted by startups, particularly one startup. But that's all history. That was some 10 years ago. And now we're still the market leader. We're a fully fledged digital brand, an online marketplace. And we get approximately 12 million visits a month from about 5 million consumers, submitting approximately 400,000 leads to about 2,000 dealers per month. Those are the leads we can count. So we've learned some stuff over the last 20 years. And one of the core things that I've learned is that most automotive markets, I would almost hazard a guess to say almost all automotive markets are more similar than they are different. Here in Portugal, in England, in the United States, and in South Africa. If you look at all of the economic metrics in the automotive industry, they are more similar than they are different. And that goes for dealerships, it goes for marketplaces like AutoTrader, like Standvirtual, and it even goes for some regulation. Some countries are ahead on regulation, other countries are behind. But by and large, what I've seen over the last 20 years is that it's more similar than it is different. And this industry that we find ourselves in, called the automotive industry, is very fragmented. Dealerships are fragmented, small, owner-operated in the most part. And I'm sure that resonates with you. Is that the case in Portugal? Owner-operated, small dealerships. And when I say small, I don't mean minute, I mean there's lots of dealerships. But that unfortunately leaves dealerships exposed to disruption. So this decentralized, fragmented nature of car dealerships in an industry makes you even more susceptible to disruption and accelerated by the internet, digital products and services. The opportunity to disrupt has always been there, but the internet has just accelerated the opportunity for disruption. The reality I found, though, is that dealerships and the automotive industry, by and large, don't move quick enough. We don't move as fast as the consumer moves. And we saw that when we were a print business. We didn't move fast enough. It took us 10 years to transition from being a traditional print magazine to being an online marketplace. Fortunately, we're still market leader and we've saved the day. But we are now perfectly positioned, just like Standvirtual, to have an overview of the market. We can see things before they happen, in most cases. And Standvirtual is on the same path. I would even argue that Standvirtual is ahead of AutoTrader South Africa in some things that I've learned over the last 2 days, that I might just take back to South Africa and say to my team, what's going on here? Why aren't we doing this? So if they're on the same path, I would encourage you to be early adopters of not only their products, but there's another thing you should be early adopters of a marketplace of, and that is their thinking. Because marketplaces have the perfect position within the stratosphere to see the whole market. And if you can take some of that thinking and embed it in your dealership, like I'm going to try and deliver to you today, you will transform your dealership. Because if you don't, you stand the risk of becoming irrelevant. Now, that's a strong word. Becoming irrelevant in a world of constant change. Only if you stand still. You can avoid this irrelevance. And there's too much to talk about here, so I'm going to try and unpack this in 3 particular lessons that I've learned, that we've learned back at AutoTrader in South Africa. And lesson number 1 is that the speed of becoming irrelevant seems fast, when in reality, it's actually quite slow. And the reason it seems fast is because we only realize that we are irrelevant as a business when it's too late. The point at which we realize that it's too late makes it seem incredibly quick. So I'm sure that you'll all agree if we are forced to adapt to change, especially in this internet world. And technology has moved beyond smartphones and laptops. It's now moved to wearable devices, smart home devices, and now artificial intelligence. I believe there's even an app on the Apple Watch that can help couples fall pregnant. I haven't seen the app, but I believe it exists. So moving on to one of the first examples I have for you. Does everybody in the room remember Kodak? You remember Kodak, right? This was the biggest camera brand the world had ever seen. And after dominating the photo film industry for most of the 20th century, Kodak completely went away. But you know what the strange thing about the story is? Nobody noticed. No one noticed Kodak disappear. They just faded into oblivion. Do you remember the moment that Kodak disappeared? Probably not. So Kodak made a fundamental error. Guess when? Back in 1975, they made a fundamental error. An employee by the name of Stephen Sasson presented to senior management this groundbreaking idea. The idea was the digital camera. Sounds simple, right? Wouldn't you chomp at the bit if you were Kodak? Guess what? Kodak rejected the idea. Off the bat, no discussions. The senior management rejected the idea. So what did Stephen do? He went to Kodak's biggest competitor, Sony, presented the idea. And Sony couldn't get enough of this idea and launched their version of the digital camera. So Kodak's revenue slowly declined from 1975 to the point at which they filed for bankruptcy in January 2012. I'd bet that nobody even knows they filed for bankruptcy in January 2012, or very few people do, because they just faded into irrelevance. What's the moral of the story, though? Often the biggest risk in business is the opportunity cost, the cost of doing nothing. That's the biggest risk in business, the cost of staying the same. So don't hang on to the stuff we've done before, because we've done it before. Because lesson 2 becomes even more important and accelerates this journey of change, and that is transparency. I'm so glad that we've been talking about transparency the whole morning, because I didn't collaborate with Nuno in this presentation. And it's very refreshing that a lot of the same content is coming through. Consumers want transparency. They want you to give them a reason to trust you. They're not looking to catch you out. They want reasons to trust you. You may think that transparency in the context of trust means they want to catch you out, but they actually don't. So how are they doing it at the moment? And I think you all know the answer to this question. Google reviews. I don't know if you've got Trustpilot here. Social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Those are the places that consumers are going to review your dealership, to review any brand for that matter, but we're talking about the automotive industry today. So what do they find on those platforms? Mostly negative signals. What are they looking for? They're looking for positive signals. They're not really looking for negative signals. They want a reason to buy from you. But what do they find? Negative signals and avoid. That's what we find in South Africa. Nobody is addressing those negative signals. So would you agree with me that transparency then builds trust? And that's the whole point I wanted to make up to this point. Would you agree with me that transparency builds trust? Yeah? But then ask yourself the question, how? How does transparency build trust? What are the elements? What are the ingredients in building trust or using transparency? And in my mind, there's 2 ways to build trust. The first way is behavioral trust. How I act is predictable. Behavioral trust. But the downside of behavioral trust in a brand, in your dealership brand, is that it takes long to build. Behavioral trust. There's another kind of trust that is immediate. If you do this, you will start to gain trust with your car buyer almost immediately. And that is what I call vulnerability-based trust. Making yourself vulnerable. And we're going to get into the mechanics and details of vulnerability-based trust in a couple of slides' time. But this is lesson 2. Consumers want transparency. But quite often, transparency is this big word that isn't broken down into its parts. And today I'm going to try and break them down into its parts for you. So if we don't embrace transparency and build trust with our car buyers, our businesses are at risk. In today's internet world especially. Not at risk of having a bad reputation or having something bad said about you on the internet, but at risk of your consumer buying from somebody else. At risk of them trusting somebody else rather than trusting you. So this could quite literally shut a business's doors, like it did almost with US Airways, who sent their consumer trust scores plummeting through the floor when they made one move. They outsourced their customer service. It angered customers because they couldn't get responses. They couldn't get meaningful answers to questions they had or gripes they had. And their customer service scores plummeted. Why did they outsource their customer service? Because they were on a cost-cutting exercise. They thought that somebody else could do it better. Unfortunately, customer service can't be outsourced. Everybody in a business is a customer service representative, and only the people inside that business can answer the questions. Fortunately, US Airways was saved by America West in 2015. Just before bankruptcy, because they were on a path to disaster based on one fundamental decision. I'm sure the other fundamentals were also not great, but this was one fundamental decision that sent them plummeting. So we've learned at AutoTrader, particularly from our print to digital transition, that businesses change a lot slower than what we realize. And the disruption only comes at the moment that we realize. Should I say the perception of the disruption only comes at the moment that we realize. And right now, dealerships are changing faster than you may think. Your environment is changing faster than you may think. Would you agree that revenues are under pressure in this environment? It's the same in South Africa. Margins, stock is under pressure. Where you buy stock's under pressure. Your second gross or finance commission is under pressure. So dealerships are under pressure. The same scenario exists in South Africa. So how is a dealership supposed to navigate this changing world? And how is it changing? I'd like to package this in the third lesson, called divergence. Divergence is made possible by creative middlemen. Middlemen whose businesses to disrupt your dealership are accelerated by the internet. The divergence of how the consumer buys a car and how a consumer sells a car. Those two things are separating. No longer does the consumer need to trade their car in at the dealership that they are buying a car from. And that's an example of the divergence. Banks are disrupting dealerships' commission by providing direct-to-consumer finance models. Don't know if that's happening here, but it's happening in South Africa. Car manufacturers are moving towards an agency model and then direct to the consumer. Don't know if that's happening here, but BMW and Mercedes did a pilot using South Africa as its test bed for the agency model. And all of this stuff is good for the consumer. You can't argue that it's bad for the consumer because it's good for the consumer. But ask yourself, how quickly are you as a business able to adapt to these changes and to these disruptions in order to either sidestep it or go along with it? Those are the options. And at AutoTrader, again, we found that using data, now there's two types of data. There's qualitative data and quantitative data. And both are relevant. Most people focus on quantitative data. It's important, but qualitative data is the data you're receiving from me now. It's all the data you've got from Stan Virtual this morning. That's qualitative data. Data is the most important ingredient in recognizing an impending disruption. And so we saw this disruption coming as a business in AutoTrader, moving from print to digital. And so we didn't become a Kodak. Because you see, this third lesson in divergence and the creative middlemen taking the lunch of the car dealership, you don't see it coming. Let me give you 3 examples. The first example is, in South Africa, we learnt that with the advent of the internet and the momentum that the internet gave us and the transparency the internet gave us, dealers lost touch with the ability to value cars. And it happened without them knowing. The ability to value cars live, realizing that the change of a price of a car happens very quickly, week to week, month to month, even quicker. That dealerships weren't offering consumers convenience, delivering the car to the consumer or going to the consumer to buy the car, rather trying to lure the dealer to the consumer to the dealership. And then sometimes dealers put too much into reconditioning. I'm not saying don't recondition cars, but sometimes dealerships put too much into reconditioning. And miscreative financing solutions when interest rates rise, like subscriptions. In South Africa at the moment, subscriptions are starting to take off. Why? Because interest rates are at almost 12%. So consumers still need to drive cars, they still want to buy cars, but they don't get the affordability or the finance because of the high interest rates. So now dealerships are jumping on the bandwagon to offer subscriptions to consumers to buy cars. So you see, if a disruptive middleman takes those 3 elements, knows how to value a car, and then decides to undercut the margin to take less, plays into the convenience of the consumer, goes to the consumer to do the deal, to buy, and doesn't put as much into reconditioning costs, guess what happens then? They get all the cars from the consumer market. And the next step in this journey is they begin to sell the cars to dealerships. And before you open your eyes, you have 1, 2, or 3 sources of stock, which is no longer the consumer because of the divergence. And then the ultimate happens. They become a dealership. And they start retailing cars to consumers, while still holding the stock in the market. And that's how quickly disruption happens. This is not the first time this has happened. Those of you who are as old as me, do you remember when dealerships changed tires, changed shocks and exhausts in the service centers? I remember 20, 30 years ago, dealerships used to offer those services. Where are those services now? With third parties. So you make money when you interact directly with the consumer. And my whole point of lesson 3 is don't lose touch with the consumer, because therein lies the disruption. Therein lies the margin compression. At AutoTrader, we realized that this was happening to dealers. So we constantly try and build tools and put data out into the market to try and have an opinion, to try and see these trends coming, so that dealerships can make decisions. Because quite often, you have to be part of the disruption. You can't avoid it. And it's just a matter of embracing it and deciding how your business will change. And Stan Virtual is on the same journey, from what I've learned over the last couple of days. And if you take nothing else from my talk today, embrace the 50,000 foot data. Embrace all of the data that Standvirtual can give you, because it'll help you see trends and impending disaster coming. So that's enough about the scaremongering. Now let me tell you what some of the solutions are. And we'll go back to lesson 2, which is transparency. It's happening all the time. And it's accelerated by the internet, as we said. And consumers have always wanted as much information as possible before they buy a product, before they buy a service. They want as much information as possible. And we spoke about predictive trust, behavioral trust. Behavioral trust feeds into brand building. But there's this vulnerability-based trust that allows you to begin building trust almost immediately. Let's use an example of predictive trust. Does everybody not eat McDonald's burgers? Okay. Arguably, McDonald's makes a not so good burger. Would you agree? Okay. So why do consumers trust McDonald's? And I've given you the answer already, so you're probably thinking about it. It's because they're predictable. That's why consumers trust McDonald's. If I come to Portugal, or if I go to South Africa, or if I go to England, the McDonald's burger is exactly the same. And that's predictive trust. You can trust that McDonald's is going to make the same burger everywhere you go. And on the other hand, however, vulnerability-based trust is a whole different ballgame. Predictive trust takes a long time to build, and I would encourage you to do it. But vulnerability-based trust, you can build immediately. But it's tricky. When consumers see that you're being transparent, warts and all, the good things about the car, the good things about your brand, and the bad things, or the not so good things, let's not call them bad things, trust goes up with your car buying consumer. So where do you build these kinds of trust? Or this kind of trust, should I say? And I'm going to present 3 places that you can start with immediately. There's lots of places that you can build vulnerability-based trust, but there's 3 places. The first being pricing transparency. Now, you might have heard this before, but how did you arrive at that price? It's important that the consumer knows how you arrived at that price. On the trade side, when you buy a car, as well as on the retail side, when you sell a car. How your cars compare in the market. Now, Standvirtual has this functionality on their platform. How does your car compare to the market? Are you using tools to compare your positioning in the market? But more importantly, it's not about being the cheapest. It's explaining why your car is priced where it's priced. Therein lies the transparency. So you've got to understand all that other stuff before you can answer the why. And then regular and rigorous pricing and repricing on an ongoing basis. This pricing transparency online is really designed to ensure that buyers have all the pricing information to make one key decision. And it's not, are you the cheapest? It's, am I paying a fair price for the value I'm getting? In the used car space, it applies particularly, and that's because used cars are not commodities. One used car is not the same as the next used car. So the transparency around how you arrived at that price is even more critical for used cars versus new cars. The second place that you can build vulnerability-based trust and transparency is dealership, I'm so sorry, listing transparency. Now, we spoke about pricing transparency. Listing transparency is information about the car. It might seem trivial, and you might have heard all this before, but is all the information available about the history of that car? Somebody was speaking, and the translation is really good. Somebody was speaking earlier about putting a Bible on the dashboard. you might think it's funny, but it's relevant. The history of the car is incredibly important to the next consumer buying the car. The service history, the accurate description of the features, the financing options. But all of those things are factual. And factual information is important. You've got to have as much factual information as you can have. The second part of listings transparency is telling a story about the car. Too often in South Africa, even today, after we've been preaching this for 5 odd years, I see dealers use the comment section of the VDP to list the features of the car. From very young, we've grown up with fairy tales, stories. I'm even telling you a story today. And we're captivated by stories. The movie industry wouldn't be as big as it is if it wasn't for stories. And that's no different with a car, with a listing. Tell the story in full sentences. Captivate the consumer's mind. Try and keep him on your VDP for as long as humanly possible. Because the funny thing about humans is that we are drawn to stories. We're drawn to fairy tales. And don't tell fairy tales about the car, but tell stories. And then find other places to tell the story of the car. You've got wonderful places to tell stories. Your own VDP. Is your VDP longer than Standvirtuals? I would challenge you to always keep your VDP longer than Standvirtuals. Whatever they do, do it on your own dealership website. And then do more. Make it as long as possible. And then make it your mission to out VDP the dealership next door to you. Because the consumer wants that kind of transparency. And then lastly, on the dealership floor, how much information do you have about the car on your dealership floor? Most of the dealerships that I walk into in South Africa, they've got a window sticker with the price, the year model, and the mileage. Nothing else about the car. There's a perfect opportunity there. You've got a captive audience in the consumer that is probably going to buy from you. So captivate their imagination around that car. And the third then is dealership transparency. And this is not to be confused with brand building. What I mean by dealership transparency feeds into the vulnerability-based trust. You need to be vulnerable online and give consumers a place to engage with you. If you can't give consumers a place to engage with you, go and engage with them where they are posting reviews, posting starred ratings. Go and engage with the consumer. Because if you're vulnerable on those platforms, trust goes up. We often find that the dealerships in South Africa that do this well, it's not about getting defensive. It's more about engaging with the consumer in that moment. And somebody also said that quite often the consumer removes a bad review if you deal with it in the right way. So go and engage with them on those platforms. But more importantly, try and draw them into a trusted platform that you trust. Whether that be on your own dealership website, whether that be on Standvirtual's platform, draw them to a place that they can actually give you reviews, rather than doing it on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. So to sum up, the world is changing slowly, and we often think that it changes really quickly. But that's because the place at which we find ourselves when we realize it, and that's almost too late. Always keep your finger on the qualitative and quantitative data pulse. Don't only always go to the quantitative data. Use qualitative data to your advantage too. And be aware of creative middlemen. Many dealerships in South Africa have been disrupted with products and services because they didn't see the creative middlemen coming. Second, build vulnerability-based trust. Build predictive trust too, but build vulnerability-based trust. Win the loyalty of your customer through transparency. Be the most transparent dealer in Portugal. Through pricing transparency, listings transparency, and dealership transparency. Don't try and outsmart the consumer because they're looking for reasons to trust you. They're not looking for reasons not to trust you. Because brand love will build in your dealership the moment you start vulnerability-based trust building. And then lastly, transform your dealership. Lead, try, fail, try again. Don't take the wait and see approach. Buying and selling has existed for thousands and thousands of years. Today is no different, it's just faster. Find your competitive edge. I know you can. I've seen hundreds of dealers in South Africa do this successfully. And if you reach out to me, I can give you some names of examples. So thank you for having me. Feel free to reach out to me at any time.